Welcome to ExperienceTalks, the radio magazine for the experienced listener. I'm Cynthia Friedlob. Today's show is from our 2015 ExperienceTalks archives. Host Dr. Connie Corley welcomes guest Gary GLAZNER, a poet and author of the book Dementia Arts, Celebrating Creativity in Elder Care. Here's Connie.
Gary GLAZNER is the founder and executive director of the Alzheimer's Poetry Project, APP. The APP has been a recipient of numerous awards and has been featured on the PBS NewsHour, NBC's Today Show, and NPR's All Things Considered. Events have been held by the Alzheimer's Poetry Project in half of the states in the U.S. and in 4 countries internationally, including Australia, Germany, Poland, and South Korea. GLAZNER is the host and co-producer with the New York Memory Center of the monthly Memory Arts Cafe, a series of free arts events for people living with Alzheimer's disease, their caregivers, and the general public in New York. GLAZNER is also the founder of the Institute for Dementia Education and Arts, IDEA, and he's a poet who was a key figure in the Poetry Slam movement. Among his published books are How to Make a Living as a Poet, How to Make a Life as a Poet, and his latest book, Dementia Arts, Celebrating Creativity in Elder Care, which is published by Health Professional Press. We'll be talking to Gary about this book and the amazing stories that unfold in it. Gary GLAZNER, welcome to KPFK's ExperienceTalks.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you.
I'm really delighted that you could join us today. Gary, I'm guessing there are people who might be skeptical about sharing poetry or even the notion of creating poetry with people who have dementia. But you've been doing this now for decades, and you've taught many others your very successful approaches. How did you come up with the idea for starting to use poetry with people who have dementia?
In 1997, I got a small grant to work at an adult daycare center in Northern California, and there was no instruction, just to use poetry. I didn't know very much about Alzheimer's or dementia or memory loss, but I knew enough that I thought I probably couldn't do a traditional poetry workshop. So I hit on the idea of using classic poems that people might have learned as kids. And my moment of inspiration was there was a man in the group. His head was down, seemingly unaware of his surroundings. He wasn't participating at all. And I said the Longfellow poem. I shot an arrow into the air, and his eyes popped open, and he said, "It fell to earth, I know not where."
Wow.
And suddenly he was able to participate, and it just was a really joyous moment for me as a poet to see how powerful the poems could be. And so since that time, I've developed the Alzheimer's Poetry Project, and as you said, we've worked in all over the country and even internationally. And so one of the things, when you mentioned that people might be skeptical about using poetry with people living with memory loss, I think most people associate poetry as a solitary art form.
Yes.
The sort of cliche is the, tortured genius in the ivory tower, with dusty books around them, writing poems by themselves. And I see poetry, there is that part of it where people write poems by themselves. Of course, there's part of it. But it also has a tremendous history as an oral art form.
Yes.
And I see it, the strength as the oral art form, and also people of this generation often would recite poems as entertainment. And we now see an incredible resurgence of young people being interested in writing, rhymed, rhythmic poems because of their interest in hip-hop culture. And so it's rich and it's all around us. And when you think of it as an oral art form, it maybe makes more sense of why it would reach a person with memory loss.
Ah, okay. Well, in your book, Dementia Arts, you talk about this concept of echoic memory, like an echo, which is what we'll talk soon about some of your techniques that you use with poetry and other ways that you bring in the spoken word. But what does echoic memory mean, and how would that be relevant to somebody who has dementia?
So that's a sensory memory, and we have these, from our five senses, we have these different types of memory, and echoic is an auditory memory that happens to be 4 to 8 seconds long. So it's the type of memory we would use to write down a phone, not write down a phone number, but hold a phone number in our mind long enough to write it down, right? And so that 4 to 8 seconds length corresponds almost exactly to a length of poetry, say, written by Shakespeare. So, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. That's exactly in that time frame. And so when you're using that type of memory, it plays on a strength with people living with dementia instead of their weakness, which would be the short-term memory or even autobiographical memory as they start to progress with the disease. So instead of saying, Mom, do you remember that time we went to the lake? You're saying, repeat after me these words. So that's a technique that is core to the Alzheimer's Poetry Project that's called call and response. And that seems to be, even in fairly late-stage dementia, people can be successful. And you can imagine if you couple that success with saying those words, along with the fact that a small percentage will actually remember lines of poetry, and you can use songs too, which people remember lyrics of songs much more than poems. But either one of those, you can imagine how powerful it feels for them to be successful at it.
Right, and also these are very much in the moment kinds of experiences, as well as creating memories that are happening right now, that perhaps there could be ways to stimulate people remembering these kinds of events by perhaps recording them or having visual associations that people can remember these experiences by. So can you talk a little bit about how you use, in addition to words, props, for example?
Well, I think this is a great place to sort of break down the 4 main techniques that we use.
Great.
So just briefly, the core one is call and response. And so that's the example that I gave where the session leader or the poet, or even in the home, if you want to use this with your loved one, you say a word or a line of poetry and have the person or the group respond back. So let's try that. Okay. You and I, Connie, will try it. And we can say to the listeners at home, when Connie's saying her part, you can join in with her. So we're going to use, this is the opening part of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And it's just real simple. I'm just going to say the words of the poem, and then, Connie, you say them back to me. And the listeners can say them with you.
That's perfect. Go ahead.
All right, here we go. Once upon a midnight dreary.
Once upon a midnight dreary.
While I pondered weak and weary.
While I pondered weak and weary.
While I nodded nearly napping.
While I nodded nearly napping.
Suddenly there came a tapping.
Suddenly there came a tapping.
As of someone gently rapping.
As of someone gently rapping.
Rapping at my chamber door.
Rapping at my chamber door.
Quote the raven.
Quote the raven.
Nevermore.
Nevermore.
So you can see how easy it is to do that. Yes. And how playful you can be. I brought in snoring sounds and tapping sounds, and you can do it upbeat, as if maybe it's almost like a square dance, or you can do it, really spooky, and the person can match your voice. So that's a really fun, easy technique to do, and that's the core of our work that we do with people with memory loss. And then in addition to that, we'll bring in props. So, for instance, with that poem, I actually have some raven feathers. Oh. And we bring those in, and the person can touch it to their hand or their cheek, and we talk about how it feels. You can do funny things with it, like, if you hold it up to under your nose, it looks like a mustache, or you can hold it like a quill, like how people would write with a quill.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, again, that's hitting on these different senses, in this case, touch.
Yes.
But you can also bring in, things that the person can smell, like, for instance, rose petals are wonderful to work with. I had a group in Wisconsin that did April. It was a beautiful April day, and they did April rain songs and brought in fresh lemonade and strawberries. So that these props are ways to engage the people's different senses. And then we talk about the poems, so we ask questions around them. All these methods are ways to draw the person out, to get to them, to participate, and they're all things that can happen in the moment. We're not asking the person to remember something that happened, but what's in front of them.
Yes.
And so I'll just ask you, like, what's a question if we were doing a poem about the raven and we had raven feathers, what might you ask someone about that? What would you say, Connie?
Well, I want to know what's the difference between a raven and a crow, because I see these big black birds flying around and making noises, and I don't know. There's big ones and little ones, so I don't know the difference.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and maybe I don't really know the answer. I think it's maybe the size, but or I guess they're different species, but they seem similar to me.
Yeah,
but one of the things you bring up right away is how big they are, what color they are, what sounds do they make. So these are all things that we can talk about, and then we reinforce by repeating the poem. And then the fourth technique that we use, and this is shared by many different dementia arts projects, including Time Slips, that was created by Ann Bastings out of Milwaukee, Songwriting Works, which is Judith Kate Friedman up in Washington State.
Yeah, she's been a guest on ExperienceTalks.
Yeah, so she uses, both of those projects use similar ways to create songs or poems, which is essentially asking questions around a theme. So with the raven, we might ask, where would you fly if you were a bird? So we might have a series of bird poems, maybe The Eagle by Tennyson, maybe Hope is a Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson, and then start to ask that, and then we write down the people's answers, and that makes the lines of the poem. And that's really a fun thing to do, and you can do that in group settings, or you can do it one-on-one, and maybe it's just simply talking about where the person would like to fly and then writing that down. And again, you are using your memory because you're thinking about, like, for instance, someone might say they want to fly to Paris. So they're thinking about Paris. But the difference is this shift of creativity, right? So you're asking, in the moment, where would they like to fly? You're not saying to them, try to remember the time we went to Paris.
Right.
And so that seems to be a way that we store memories, and maybe the way that we access them, that people living with memory loss is a weakness for them. They might talk quite readily about food that they would eat in Paris, things they might see, but if you try to make it be, remember that specific time we went, that seems to be harder. Right.
So in other words, these techniques that you use bring people into the moment of creativity. So it may elicit memories, but people are creating real, live, engaging experiences. And I wanted to quote one of my mentors, and probably yours as well, the late Dr. Gene Cohen, who said that creativity is like chocolate for the brain.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And it really can be, I mean, for me, I'm a poet, so I love performing poems and saying poems and creating them. But if this is your husband or your mom and you want to step out of that caregiver role for a moment, and maybe this is just 15 minutes or 30 minutes, but you can imagine how powerful it can be where, these types of programs build on good caregiving. We have to have that. We have to have nourishment for the person and cleanliness and rest and all that. But for the person to step outside for even a little bit and, talk about a rose that you've picked from a garden and say to them, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. My love is like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. And another technique that we find really powerful is you take the person's hand and move their hand gently to the rhythm of the poem. And you say that poem with them, and they say it back, or maybe they're at a part with dementia where they don't say the words back, but they often you'll see the expression of emotion in their eyes and this bonding that happens. And it's just powerful to give people another way to communicate and another tool in their caregiving, different options that they have.
Right. And I want to remind our listeners that we're talking to Gary GLAZNER. He's the author of the book Dementia Arts, Celebrating Creativity in Elder Care. And I wanted to segue our discussion for a moment to the whole arena of what happens when people have dementia. And I'm one of these people, because of my work in the field of aging, people will say to me, well, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? And of course, there are a lot of misconceptions about what happens, even just in quote-unquote normal aging. There are often people who assume that it's inevitable to forget things and the dreaded senior moment and so on. So I'm just curious, Gary, how do you respond when people ask you about, well, why are you doing this kind of work? Aren't people going to forget everything, or isn't it inevitable and there's no cure and no really good way to prevent dementia? What do you say to people when they ask you these questions?
Well, one of the most poignant times that I remember around this type of question, and this is with activities director Ruth Dennis, who works at Sierra Vista Assisted Living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They're one of the first groups that I started to work with. And with Ruth, someone asked her that exactly thing. They said, why bother? They're going to forget everything anyway, and it's not going to change the course of the disease. And she said, why not bother? And we have to do everything we can to make the person's life as, creative and as wonderful as we can. And I think it's our mark of us as a community and as a society with our most vulnerable people. How do we treat them? And I think if you can improve the quality of life for somebody, if you can smile and laugh for even a short time, that it's really worthwhile. Now, we see studies. There's a study that comes out of Germany and Austria in 2004 that shows reciting poetry using call and response lowers the heart rate and the pulse, which is an indication that stress is being lowered. So you see that. We see the work of Professor Philip Davis out of Liverpool in England, where he has an experiment where he puts students in an fMRI machine and they encounter lines of Shakespeare, and it shows that the language centers of the brain start to have more synaptic activity. So, you can say it reduces stress. You can show that it's increasing synaptic activity to use poetry and beautiful language. So there's real health benefits that we're starting to see, and of course with Gene Cohen's work, we see that that there's health benefits from using professionally created arts projects, and that landmark study that he did. So we have this range of responses we can see from research and increasing research that it's beneficial. Doing movement and dance, you can see that it can reduce falls. I mean, there's benefits financially for assisted living and adult day to do these programs. But for me, at the heart is I want to see that person smile, and that's what I get from them is, when you live in the moment, it is beautiful, and there's so much laughter and humor that people bring to this, even in the devastating course of losing memory. And one of the things I like to share with people is I was reciting that poem by Robert Burns, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, in a facility in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And there was a woman, and I just gently brushed her hand, the back of her hand, as I was going around the room and reciting the poem. And you would have said from across the room that she wasn't listening. Her eyes were closed, and her little finger came up and grabbed my little finger and just held on, and she would not let go until I finished the poem. And so there's these really powerful, beautiful moments. And I'll tell you, from my own life, when I began this work in 1997, my mom was in the last stages of cancer. She had tumors in her brain and was on heavy-duty pain medicine, and so she had dementia-type behavior. My mom and dad, my mom's Frankie, my dad's Billy, they were childhood sweethearts and became boyfriend and girlfriend at age 5 and 6.
Wow.
And so there was a day my dad called, and he said, your mom's really agitated. She's asking for cherry ice cream. And I knew it was a big deal because he never asked for help, like so many caregivers. And so I got the ice cream, and I remember this moment so strongly. I looked back, and I had all the books from the poetry workshop, from that initial workshop, and I just thought, I'm going to bring them in and use them with my mom. And so one of the rhymes in the book was, can you bake a cherry pie, Billy Boy? And my mom had teased my dad with that when they were little kids.
Wow.
And so I started to say that to her, and she started to sing it and to do these little hand motions and be very playful. Can you bake a cherry pie, Billy Boy, Billy Boy? And again, it just hit me how powerful these poems and songs and rhymes can be with people. In this case, you know, with my own mother in hospice, and she passed away shortly after that. So it just reinforced to me, it kind of made me want to dedicate my life to doing this work.
That's such a powerful story, and it's one of many amazing stories you have in your book, Dementia Arts, Celebrating Creativity in Elder Care. We're talking to Gary GLAZNER on Experience Talks. And Gary, I want to take a couple of minutes because we're almost out of time, unfortunately, but we'll have you back. I want to tell our listeners how you have set this book up, because it's really fun to look at it as a book with recipes. So you take some of these approaches and techniques and create little recipes in there. And you also have an index in the back, because a lot of times, as I was reading, for example, I remembered, you know, a line of a poem and I Googled it, but sometimes it's just easier right with the book in hand. So you've got at the very end the first line of poems, because oftentimes you're right, people remember something about a poem, but not all of them. And people can go into the book. You don't have to have any professional training in the arts or even in elder care to pick up and find something of interest or a story that's heart-rendering and inspiring even. So how did you get the idea to make the book the way you did with the recipes and so on?
Well, I was reading the New York Times cookbook, and there was a part in it where it talked, Amanda Hesser said that she would be worried if you stirred risotto too much, and she didn't want to worry, so you're not going to do that, are you? And I just thought, that's the tone I want to have for my book. And so I want the art lessons to be easy to use, and I thought, well, people love recipes, and I want it to be nourishing, and that's recipes, and I wanted it to be, you know, on a daily basis you could use these, and you would adapt them, because we all adapt recipes to our own use. And so I just thought, what a great form to use, and it was really fun to come up with the, you know, titles that sounded like old recipes and made people think of that. And then it really broke down the art lessons into, you know, what ingredients do you need and what are the instructions. And so it was really fun to use that framework, and it freed me up and was a real creative exercise to do. And some are just funny and silly, and some are very instructional.
Yes, right. So again, it's quite an engaging way to approach these various ideas that you've talked about, and you have a lot of good information, resources in the back. And one of the things I wanted to mention is the National Center for Creative Arts, which is part of a Dementia Arts Research Ensemble. I love that. It's an ensemble of different organizations. Our very own Tim Carpenter, who hosts Experience Talks as well and maintains the website as part of Engage, which he directs. I know you've done some work with Tim, and I'm going to invite our listeners to go to our website, ExperienceTalks.org, and we'll have more information about Gary, a link to the book and to his websites. But could you tell us, just so before we wrap up, what are websites that people could look at to find out about the Alzheimer's Poetry Project and so on?
Well, I'm really glad you brought up Tim, and Tim and I both serve on the board of National Center for Creative Aging. So that's a website that's got a lot of resources, and it hasn't launched yet, but it will launch soon. I'm part of a group that's created a caregiver tool guide.
Excellent.
And it's actually got videos of all of these things we're talking about today and some of the groups we've mentioned. So there's that one that's coming up. My website is the Alzheimer's Poetry Project, which is alspoetry.com. And then there's the Institute for Dementia Education and Arts, or IDEA, and that one's under dementiaarts.com. And we've got a YouTube channel. If you Google Alzheimer's Poetry Project and go to the YouTube, you can find dozens and dozens of videos and examples of people being successful in doing this and, having a lot of fun doing it. And we've got a blog where we post poems and stories and things.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Gary GLAZNER, author of the book Dementia Arts, Celebrating Creativity in Elder Care. We're also deeply grateful for our Experience Talk web diva, Cynthia Friedlob, and the production staff of KPFK. So once again, please like us on Facebook, go to ExperienceTalks.org for more information on Gary GLAZNER, and for archives of our shows under Listen.
And that's our show. You can get more information about any of our guests and listen to previous shows on our website at ExperienceTalks.org. Experience Talks is produced by the nonprofit Engage, catalyzing the art of active aging. Thanks to the production staff at KPFK Radio, and thanks to you for listening.